You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome everybody. This is I Love You Keep Going. It's September 15th, 2022. It's 7:36 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And we've been talking about preliminary practices really and attachment. I think one of the things that we're going to do at Mettagroup is shift more into discussions around that. I think largely the thing that interests people about the work that we do is that attachment focus piece. And so I thought I would just talk a little bit about that. I've often referred to it as a preliminary practice, something that you engage in so that you can set yourself up to a place of then being able to pursue deeper practice. One of the things about the West is that we don't have that sort of rote dedication to practice that is so characteristic of Asia. In Myanmar, I went to a monastery outside of Mulamin, which was a big place, 700 acres. And there was a wall down the middle of the 700 acres dividing the women's side from the men's side, and it was very traditional in that way. And I was talking to them about bringing a group of people to come and practice, which is something you need to do if you want to bring a group, is to talk to them about the kind of practice that you want to do and who's likely to come and how serious the practice is. And then they asked me if I would do them a favor, which was to go and spend an hour with a monk so that he could practice speaking English, because they were training him as a translator and they wanted him to be able to learn English. And so I went and sat with him, and he'd been a monk for 5 years, and he was breath counting 1 to 10 down to 1 on the out breath only. And that was a steady progression of increasing difficulty of practice over 5 years. Know anybody in the West that's willing to do that? We want to go straight to the advanced practices, jump over all of the preliminaries. And I think one of the reasons that we get into difficulty with the practice is that when we do that kind of jump, there's no foundation to support some of the experiences that can come up. Christian?
I know I've asked you about this before, but like, do you think that there's actually a progression that someone can do over the course of 5 years of that kind of practice? Or is it just like, like you'll know when you get to a billion or something like that?
Well, I would say from the conversation with him that he could get into Vipassana jhana pretty easily, and that he was really exploring the esoteric jhanas in that process, but that he hadn't really gone into the Vipassana side at all, and that they didn't do much in the way of the heart practices. He needed, I guess, to have a facility for that, or to satisfy some requirement of his teachers that he didn't share with me, and so I don't know. He was also young, and so it may be that they needed him to mature. He was in his early 20s at that point, and maybe they needed him to be more mature to offer the other practices. He had made the commitment to be, a lifer, in terms of the monastic vows, which does open up a whole path that isn't available to people who aren't that committed. And then we talked in English, and he had these whiteboards, and he wanted to learn idioms, American idioms, so that he would be more conversant with the American students that were coming there. But it's quite interesting about how men and women are culturated differently. At that monastery, on the women's side, when you went into the meditation halls, they were absolutely pristine. Everything was super neat. The windows were all open. It was light. The air was blowing through. And when you went to the men's side, all of the windows were closed. All of the drapes were pulled. It smelled like a locker room. It was just this dark cave where people were practicing, quite different in that
I think I went to engineering school at that monastery.
Quite likely. Of course, the monastics were the ones on the male side, and because of the patriarchal nature of the organization, most of the practitioners on the women's side were lay people. So quite different in that way too. There's no real path forward for women in the monastic community. So here we take on this practice most of the time. I think the initial introductions, at least now, are going to be through some form of mindfulness practices, so a secularized practice, which is really oriented about an improvement in concentration, an improvement in a baseline happiness, for instance, and not so oriented toward seeing the human condition the way that it is, enlightenment. So it's sort of a lifestyle improver for the mainstream culture that we have. Let's see here. There we go. I was never in that group that fit in easily into mainstream culture, and in fact, if you go back to the early time of practice in the late 60s and early 70s, being a gay person was really way outside of what was acceptable in the mainstream. So I never really explored or pursued interests that were available there because it required a level of hiding that I wasn't willing to do. I remember the Beatles came out with the White Album, and they went to India and sat with the Maharishi, and TM was sort of what was happening for a lot of people, and I got a mantra and practiced it, and was able to get into some basic concentration experiences. But it wasn't really addressing the depth of suffering that I had coming out of the kind of childhood experiences I had into a culture that was so hostile. What's happening here? Let's see. When I was living in London in the early 70s, Ram Dass's book came out, and actually it was written in a way that you could follow along with it and practice the things that he was describing and have meditative experiences that were beyond what a basic concentration practice would be. And he described the nature of an exploration of the human condition I remember I was in Switzerland, and it was raining, and on the day that they arrested Timothy Leary, and I happened to be on the block where all of the cars converged, and he came out with his umbrella, got into the back of one of the black cars, and rode off. The tendency for the mainstream cultural view to be reinforced by force or held by force is something you notice only if you don't want to participate in the mainstream culture, but is less visible if you do. If you go along with it, then you don't run into those kinds of resistances. And if you're not included in the mainstream culture, you have these experiences that people who are don't necessarily have. So I was always looking for an alternative to that. When I moved to New York in the 80s, so after that period of roaming around and trying to figure out what to do, I think it corresponds with the age that you are also. If we break it out the way that I like to talk about it, 0 to 10 is childhood, right? And then 10 to 20 is your adolescent period. And childhood, you're dependent on your caregivers. You don't really have the cognitive capacity to argue much about their point of view and the way that they hold the world and their relationship to you. But then when you hit adolescence, the mind, the physical quality of the mind begins to change. You have this huge boost in your cognitive ability, and you come into a place where you can begin to examine the deals that were made for you as a child. And in family systems where the child was valued, that the capabilities of the child were appreciated and supported, encouraged, that boost in cognitive ability strengthens the bond with the caregiver. And in family systems where the child recognizes that their interests weren't really considered, it breaks the bond. We call that epistemic trust. If you find that you were cared for and that who you were appreciated and your capacities were appreciated, and that they were encouraged, and that the caregivers told you the truth, and you had the sense that the reason that they told you the things that they did was because they thought it would be helpful to you, then that really strengthens the bond, that cognitive boost. But if you begin to recognize actually that they didn't tell you the truth, and that what they were telling you wasn't meant to be helpful, it breaks it. But that adolescent period is also a period where, as a child, you want to be able to go out and begin to expand your exploration past the narrow frame of your immediate family into the world, but you also want to be able to rush back and become a child again. And so you're demanding this tremendous flexibility in your caregivers, where they let you go with some support, and then they let you come back and collapse back into childhood, and they don't insist that you do one or the other. They support you as you explore, as you expand outside of the immediate family, but then they welcome you back. In your 20s, this is youth. Do you remember youth? I loved youth. All that energy, all that excitement. You look good. Out you go into the world, and you can go further than you could in adolescence. And what you begin to do is, out of the many directions, the many paths that are available, to begin to narrow the focus of where you're going to head in your life, what you're going to explore. And then you begin to pick up the things that you need in order to pursue the things that you want to explore. And then in your 30s, of course, that's where you choose the thing and get yourself in position for the big sprint at the gold ring in our culture, which is usually defined by social position and material achievement. But this isn't necessarily the thing that everybody wants to do. I know in that part of my life, really what I was looking for was to be less unhappy. I didn't even think that happiness was a real possibility, but I did want to be less unhappy. I wanted the suffering to abate somewhat. And so in my early 20s, moving to New York was that break with the old and the idea that I could start over and make something different than what I'd had. Was not doing a lot of meditation. But then what befell, and I think that this is something that happens to all of us, is there were these a series of setbacks that were fairly substantial, and I wasn't particularly resilient in being able to change my responses that were so conditioned. This human condition where you grow up and you learn the definitions of everything. From the perspective that I have now, one of the things that I find so delightful is this idea that we all start at zero, and then we have to learn everything. And then depending on how well we do that and how well we can understand ourselves in the systems that we grow up, allows us to sort out what's meaningful and what isn't meaningful. And if you can see that clearly, then you can organize your life in such a way that you really do head off toward what's genuinely meaningful. And so you live a rich life that's filled with one experience of meaning after another. And if you can't identify that, then you often live in a life where there's not a lot of meaning and there's confusion about what the purpose of all of this is. What is it that we're doing here? But imagine this conundrum. You grow up, you spend 70 years being alive, you gather all of this information, all of these perspectives, all of these understandings, and then you die, and it doesn't get passed along to the next person intact. The next person starts at zero and then has to learn everything all the way up in these very short clips of time when you consider the overall historic arch of our existence here. And so one of the things that's happening to me is a sense of joyfulness about it. I was traveling over the last few days. I went to my 50th high school reunion, and I had dinner with a friend who I hadn't seen since college. So from that early 20s person to a 70-year-old woman. And she was marvelously opinionated about certain things. We went to a restaurant which was basically sort of ordinary, and I was talking about how we had gone when I was in Utrecht to a fairly fancy vegan restaurant where the food was, highly engineered. And she said, "There's one thing I can't stand." And I said, "Oh, what's that?" And she said, "Going to a restaurant and them serving one pea with some foam next to it." I mean, what is foam? She made me laugh. Because indeed, at this very fancy restaurant in Utrecht, there was lots of foam. on the plate.
George, at least the foam should expand in your stomach and you feel full, but it doesn't.
And then she said, I can't stand when people call me a cis woman. And I said, oh, yeah, why is that? She said, well, it's really the erasure of women. This is what we would call a TERF if we were in our 20s, right? Second generation feminists. And that it was just really the idea that trans women would compete on sports teams with cis women was an erasure of women. And I myself think that we should be expanding the definitions of gender, not being so heteronormative. That's my complaint about it. That if trans women were competing with cis men, that would be pretty good. And if trans men were competing with cis women, that would make sense to me. And that may be the perspective of age. But I was at the hotel, and I mentioned this to the man and the woman that were at the reception desk, and the alarm in the face of the young woman who was in her 20s about this outrageous perspective and complete bafflement how anyone could come up with that solution created this real sense of delight in me, because it's so different than what was possible when I was in my 20s. You know, in my 20s, it was illegal. There was no defense. You could be beaten to death and nothing would happen to the people who killed you. And so there's that recognition of this significant change, which is, I think, progress, and no awareness on the part of this younger person that the circumstances were so significantly and different. So how do you get to know that? And one of the things that I think you need to be able to do is to be present for the experience and not tied up in the experience of self, that you don't have an identification with points of view like that, and you're open, and that you can mentalize and experience someone else's reactions to things and recognize that it's a reflection of their conditioning. And then in an unthreatened place around that, be curious and open to explore. And so really, I think that ultimately that's where practice leads. But I think also at a foundation of that is this sense of security in the world that comes from, for myself, that basic attachment understanding. One of the characteristics of insecure attachment and disorganized attachment is this fearfulness. It's another way of describing the experience of insecurity, is a fearfulness about things, a lack of a sense of safety that produces a defensiveness, which tends to lead to a grasping around the sense of self, a grasping around the sense of ideas that you have become comfortable with, often a rejection of things that contradict the points of view that you have, rather than an openness to it. The extreme polarity of the dialectic in our culture is an example of that. I like to describe it as the money power people and the community people, these two divergent ideas about what should happen. I was listening somebody talk about it, taking it all the way back to Confucianism and Taoism and legalism, these three big strains of talk of understanding of the nature of the world. The Confucianism being this sort of rigid, role-based, money power point of view, hierarchies, respect for the people who are higher up than you in the hierarchy, with the understanding that they're benevolent and will take care of you. And I hear that quite a bit in that law and order, money power idea. And then the Taoist, which is to understand the cycles of life, the nature of being born, growing old, and dying, the cycles of winter, spring, summer, fall, the sense of the collective energy of people supporting each other in this environment. And then the legalistic group, which really translates into the fascist point of view. So we have these very long arcs of ideas and forms of culture, and yet we have these individuals who are like little blips of a liveliness in that range. So how can you come into a place where you really are open to contributing to this sort of experience of being alive, free to do it, and joyful in doing it, and not so caught up? And that really brings us back to this piece of practice. I like the Buddhist frame because, and particularly the Theravada frame, which is initially investigating the nature of the experience of self as insubstantial, as not really the whole game. And in fact, one way that I like to talk about it is that you have the activity of yourself, and the conscious experience of self is the audience that watches what you do. It's not the author, not the creator, not the doer, but actually the audience. And you get into a place of openness and kindness and curiosity around what it is you're doing, rather than thinking that the self makes all of those decisions and follows through or doesn't follow through. Is that making sense? That perspective different? And then getting to a place where you've done enough intentional positivity training that experience is pleasant. I know that when I came in, the associations were so negative that each time the self-experience arose, I was in this intense negative state, and that created an aversion, a kind of self-hatred to the having to experience that intensely negative state every time my sense of self arose. So wanting to get away from it. And not really being able to recognize that what was happening there was an imbalance. And then moving toward the heart practices and intentionally developing positivity and association with the experience of self, so that when the self experience arises, what arises is this very pleasant experience. Then the aversion toward the sense of self disappears. And there's a pleasant curiosity about what I'm going to do, right? in these situations, and a sense of confidence that I'll be able to do something that's effective. I remember a very low self-confidence. It's a very painful place, and the intentional development of confidence as this very gradual thing until the expectation really is that it will turn out okay. It's very different. This is not to say that it turns out okay, just that that's what the expectation is. That's very different than the expectation that it's going to just go completely to hell, right? Because all of the plans that you make in that unconscious processing of creating conceptual reality when you really think it's going to go badly are quite different than the things that you do when you think it's going to go well. Christian?
Sounds like you had a heckler in your audience.
What do you mean?
If the audience is watching
Oh. My sense of self was heckling my actual activity of self. Well, you know, when you form reality, conceptual reality, part of it is what you expect to happen. And part of it is who you're going to share this with. So object that can be sensed has contact with the capacity to sense. Consciousness of the sensing experience arises. It's evaluated for processing speed. Does it need urgent attention? Does it not matter whether you get to it? If there's time and it's pleasant, can you enjoy it? Then the undifferentiated sensing experience is compared to the perceptual database. And if there's a thread that has a similar enough pattern to it, that thread attaches to the experience of the present moment, and all of the meaning of all of the times that you've sensed that pattern attached to it, and it unfolds into conceptual reality. Nowhere in that process are you experiencing what's actually happening. What you're experiencing is what it means to you. If your anticipation is that you'll be delighted in and accepted and encouraged, that's very different than if you think you'll be rejected and shunned. And so the whole way that you enter into and respond to those moments is different. But it is based on the meaning that you assign rather than what's actually happening. If you go into a situation where you expect to be delighted in and you're not delighted in, it's a kind of if you go into a situation where you expect to be attacked and you attack first, then you change the nature in both cases by the action that you take. The idea with practice is to develop the capacity to mentalize fast enough so that you can see all of that unfold and you have agency to choose the way that you create conceptual reality, knowing that that's what you're doing. In the Tibetan approach, of course, we expand outward into awareness, identify with the nature of awareness and watch all of that stuff arising and passing in the experience of awareness without contracting into the identification of self, without contracting into the experience of world. These are views, attachment views are very compelling. One of the reasons that the exploration of them is so important is so that you can see when the mind is equanimous and the reflection of conceptual reality off the surface of the mind is accurate and undistorted, and when the mind isn't, and it's distorting and creating these distortions in the perception of the world. One of the reasons that I like the attachment approach to early practice is because you can describe views that are fairly easy to find. In the beginning of practice, where nothing is really well defined, and the concepts are cultural artifacts and often poetic, but not really relatable, it makes them harder to see. Whereas with the attachment conditioning, it's really embedded in your experience of things and the way that you navigate. And those things you're constantly doing, and so that they're available to you to explore easily. It's also very effective immediately in terms of being free to choose differently in the way that you represent self and world, so that the karmic threads that you create tend to be more beneficial than afflictive. Is that all making sense? Carol.
I had a really strong firsthand experience of some of the stuff that you're talking about right now. I had someone who came as a guest, and they were here a couple of weeks, and they started really like violating a lot of personal boundaries. They were staying in my studio apartment, and I had really old stuff triggered. And so buried with that old stuff was, a lot of that sense of insecurity and self-hatred and all of that. And they were things that I hadn't actively felt for a very long time. But this person, just the overall sense of lack of safety and her threats and hostile attitude, and my inability to get her to leave, or get her to comply with some, fair boundaries. I felt, she left like yesterday or the day before, but there's there's a cache of residual stuff still almost like floating to the surface. And, in terms of view, I can feel like a piece of it go through, and the view, that old negative view is there. And then it passes, and I back to kind of an energetic, joyful sense of life and taking pleasure. But wow, it's having a trigger like that. What a illustration of how mind states can,
and how deep conditioning is, and how you can work. You have to work all of it. You can't do a little bit and have the expectation that it then will free everything, which I think is one of those fascinating things. You do a lot of work, and then the majority of the conditioning is clear, and then there's these little pockets that you rarely touch into that you can almost experience as not there anymore until something happens. And
so that was the question. I'm seeing it as an opportunity. It's like, oh, okay, that little cache of stuff.
Right.
by me being, I guess, present with it as it comes up, and it's actually, I think, floating out. I'm feeling reconfigured somehow. Like it was there as some sort of, I don't know, ballast or hidden thing that I'd just gotten used to. But now I'm feeling, my sense of self is feeling different. And I feel like the potential of more freedom exists, having gone through that.
Yeah. Loading up the intentional positivity around those experiences, so that the database is then packed with the positive experiences around the old difficulty, so that when it arises again, the pattern arises with both the intense negative but also the intense positive, so it begins to balance in that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I wonder, is there a time frame on how long it takes this stuff to kind of come back into balance?
I'm back to the metaphor of Minesweeper. I don't know if you ever played it.
Minesweeper?
A PC game.
Yeah.
What happened to you is you hit a square, and then all the squares around it lit up with a high number. So it's like a minefield.
Yeah.
So you just have to be diligent and careful, and each time those reactions come up, embed positivity into them. So when they're re-remembered, they're embedded.
So even when she was here, I never acted out. I just kept that "may all beings be peaceful" mantra going, so it wouldn't affect my behavior, because I
Right.
wanted to fucking take her out.
Yeah,
you know.
exactly. Good. And then you do it enough, and then it's relieved. But it's hard to know. Sometimes using the Minesweeper metaphor, you hit a square and half the board opens up. Sometimes you hit a square and it's just really compacted. And so it depends on conditioning.
Oh yeah. You don't know what you're gonna get.
Right.
Yeah.
Shinzen, used to use the metaphor of that the card with black thread sticking out of it. And you grab a thread and you pull it.
Oh yeah.
And then you pull it. And some of them pull right out. And some of them you pull and you pull and you pull and you pull, and it never seems like you come to the end of it. If you could turn the card around and see how long the threads were, it would be easy. Right? Oh, 2 more feet. Not so bad.
Yeah.
This is a short one. But because you can't see it, then you just have to practice.
Yeah.
But
Thank
so
you.
let's do some practice. Let's do some metta for self, loving kindness for self. So how did that go? Good enough? So we just started at level 2. If you're interested in the attachment stuff, you can join the next class. Is I think next week on Tuesday. If you haven't joined by then, the class will close, and then we'll do another one in the winter. We have a retreat the first week of October. There's some spaces left in that. Take a look at that if you want. It's up at 7 Circles, which is where we've been going for the last 6 years or so. It has become a casualty of COVID, and will be closing after this retreat. So it's the last one there. I think we are going to go to Asia in February for 3 weeks, sit a retreat there. I'm not sure exactly where, but we're trying to work out the details, and hopefully we'll get that together by October, so that there's time to plan it. We'll do some, I like to say, cultural tourism, and then sit a retreat, and then do some more of that, looking around and seeing what's going on there. I offer the teachings in this class on a dana basis. Dana is the Pali word for generosity. So really appreciate it if you'd be willing to make a donation. There's a link on the website for that. It helps support me and also the work Mettagroup is doing. We're going to do a level 1 class for Central European time starting in November, and then we'll do a level 2 class for Central European time starting this winter. And then I'm going to do a retreat in Utrecht in June, if you happen to be in Europe or interested in going. So that's everything that we have scheduled and coming up. Thank you for your practice. I'll see you soon, I hope. Bye now.